Last week, we talked about sources of international law, explanations for compliance, and we began discussing some of the questions and controversies that exist in international law. One of the main sources of contestation that we discussed pertains to the question of whether or not instruments of international law function as supranational law. So questions around jurisdiction and the non-sacrosanct nature of sovereignty in law and practice have led to instruments like the responsibility to protect. This week, we move into another area of contention in international law. What problems and challenges arise around the shifting paradigms of the laws of war? And this is actually a good segue into the second part of the course, where we look more at questions of peace and security. And the next three classes look at challenges and conflict in international society, and the laws of war are very much a part of this. Here we see evidence of shifting norms, and this has been seen with the evolution of what are known as the laws of war into what is now perhaps better characterized as a body of international humanitarian law. But to understand this, we have to go back to just war theory, which has long provided the grounding for judging if it is just for a state to go to war, and the conditions under which states should fight in that war. It has been the most influential perspective on the ethics and morality of war and peace in the modern state system. But what do we mean by just war? Just war can be defined as a war that in its purpose and conduct meets certain ethical standards and so is allegedly morally justified. So this idea is based on the assumption that war can be justified and should be judged on the basis of ethical criteria. As such, just war theory is really more a field of philosophical and ethical reflection, as opposed to an actual specified, settled doctrine of international law. And it continues to be discussed and written about and debated in modern contexts. Just war theory, along with the laws of war more broadly, have always been changing. They've been an evolving project, really, responding over time to significant social, technological, and political changes that have shaped the international system. Because of this, the cardinal principles of just war theory have undergone significant challenges in recent decades. For one thing, the requirements of a just war can often raise difficult political, moral, and philosophical problems when applied in practice that have contributed to its principles not always being taken for granted. There are also some deeper criticisms of just war theory. Some argue that the standards it sets are just impossible to comply with, and it's questionable as to whether there has ever been a war in which one side, at least, has fully followed all the rules of a just war. And some would say, in fact, that it is impossible to avoid harming civilians, especially in today's age of warfare, and so the idea of just war has perhaps been made irrelevant in that sense. So all of these questions and debates over just war theory have challenged what were traditionally these sacrosanct principles. And so in some respects, the principles of just war theory have had to actually expand to reflect changes in warfare. And this is particularly the case with international legal constraints on permissible conduct in war. Thus, as Christian Roy-Smith states, over the past decade, fears have grown that the established framework of international law is crumbling, unable to deal with the revisionist practices of a unilateralist lone superpower. This leads us back to a consideration of how these ideas about the legality of war and conflict is governed. If you recall from last week, we see that there has been a series of shifts in international law. And these differences are well represented by a comparison of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, which we will discuss in class. Another example of how international law and the maintenance of peace and security in the international system can present challenges to international society is the question of civil war or irregular conflict. State-to-state war has its own problems, but how do international law and international organizations handle the problem of conflict and war happening within states? What can it tell us about the international system? We're going to talk about this and more in the next class, and as always, if you have any questions before then, please let me know so that I can address them.